All right, I
Okay.
think we're live.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the last session for today. We are so excited for this session. It has been an amazing day of events, workshops, panels, and we're so excited to see the last keynote that we have. We are joined by the wonderful Tulsee Doshi. I'm honored to be introing her and to be hearing from her. Tulsee is the head of product for Google's responsible AI and human-centered technology organization. In her role, she actually leads the development of Google-wide improvements, resources, and best practices for developing more inclusive and ethical products. And Tulsee has been recognized as one of Forbes 30 under 30 leaders and as one of the top women in AI ethics. So we are so excited to have you with us. We also know that Tulsee serves as an AI ethics advisor for growing Intertech Lemonade, and she holds a BS in symbolic systems and an MS in computer science from Stanford. A little bit about the keynote today. Without further ado, we're going to be discussing what it means to build an inclusive product and what it means for that product to actually be an equitable one. We're very thrilled to hear from Tulsee her thoughts on launching these kinds of products and the work she's done as a product manager at Google, having led over 24 critical AI related product launches. And we're very excited to explore a little bit more about how we can understand and improve fairness and inclusivity in algorithms and what that looks like in terms of long term goals for more equitable products and technology. Alrighty, then, without further ado, I would love to send it off to Tulsee to take over.
Awesome. Thanks, Krisha. And hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Hope you had an amazing day of talks and sessions. Everything that I've seen and heard so far has been incredible. So I'm really excited to be here with all of you. For those of you who were at WECode last year, you may have heard a version of this talk. Hopefully, there will be something new here for you today. And for those of you who are hearing from me for the first time, it's really great to be speaking to all of you. So as Krishna noted, I am Tulsee. I lead product for responsible AI and human-centered technology at Google. And what that means is I really focus on how do we build products that work for every single user, right? And what I'm hoping through the course of this talk is that for each of you, as you think about the products that you're building right now or are going to build, there are some insights, tips, and tricks in terms of how can you think about that for your product. And the challenge I'd pose too is that I think that often building inclusively doesn't actually have to be something that is outside of the norm, right? It can be a default way that you build and design products. And what it takes is just a little bit of a mindset shift at each stage of the product design and development process. And so hopefully I'll be able to walk through some of that today, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions. So please do share questions that you have in the chat or elsewhere, and we can go from there. All right, so to kind of get started, I really love starting with this example from the Barbie doll collection because as a young girl growing up in the United States from parents who were immigrants, I didn't actually see many Barbies that represented me, right? And you see a doll, you see a community actually created around a brand or around a doll. And really what you want as a user is to feel seen and to feel heard. And I think this latest line of Barbie does a really great job of actually showcasing what you can do and what the power is of inclusion. If you actually take a step forward in thinking about what does it look like to build a representative, what does it build to represent a product? What does it take to build a representative community and a representative brand? Another example that I love is this tweet from a couple years ago, in which a user says how joyous it is to actually use a Band-Aid that represents his own skin tone for the first time. And I want to take a minute to pause here as well, because I actually never realized that a skin tone was even meant, or a Band-Aid was even meant to represent your skin tone, right? And so the design decisions that have been made in the products that we use every day are almost implicit, right? We make decisions, for example, to have a Band-Aid be a neutral light pink tone. And the repercussions of that on consumers, on the way they think about the product, and on the way they think about the world goes down step by step by step. And so for me, I think one thing I really think about is what is the impact of the product that we're building on every single user? And what are the design decisions that we're making? And what kind of design decisions does that lead to, or what kind of outcomes does that lead to for the end user? So the question really is, how do you get to a point where you're thinking about what does it mean to build an inclusive line of Barbie dolls, or what does it mean to build a Band-Aid that really works for every user? Well, I think it starts by being really intentional about why we got here in the first place. And I think that the real key thesis here is that humans actually have a history of making product design decisions that are not in line with the needs of everyone. The Barbie example and the Band-Aid example are not examples of machine learning technology. In fact, they're not even examples of traditional technology. But what they show you is that the way that we design is often with ourselves in mind, or with the people in our community or in our company. And when we make those design decisions to make, a minimum viable product or to make something that works in the most basic sense, that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll work for every user. An example that I find that is particularly stark here is that actually until 2011, female drivers were 47%, so that's almost 50%, more likely to be severely injured in a car accident because female body type crash test dummies weren't required by the US Department of Transportation. What that means in practice is that most car manufacturers were testing with male crash test dummies, and the differences in the physical stature and structure of individuals weren't accounted for when we were designing seatbelts. Now, when you think about that example, when you think about the Band-Aid example, when you think about the Barbie example, none of these really feel like malice or problematic decisions in the sense that a user was saying, how can I build for this population, not for this one, right? They're often rational decisions, right? You're saying, okay, I want to have a crash test dummy, let me take one and use it. Or I want to build a Band-Aid that generally matches the skin tone of myself or someone else who is designing the product. And so they seem like obvious choices. And I think the real challenge to all of you, and as we are building the future of technology, is how do we change what feels obvious? And how do we build in the muscle and the structures in the way that we design products to subvert that so that we're actually designing with the margins, with the full community in mind when we're designing products? When you're building machine learning products in particular, I think the obvious becomes even more confusing, right? Because you're not necessarily building a single UI or a single product that'll work for users in the exact same way. For example, if you have a recommendation system, it might work very, very differently for different users. I might see a bunch of music recommendations. Someone else might see dance videos. Someone else might see cooking recommendations. And so what is obvious? What are the design decisions that may lead to different outcomes for different users becomes a little bit more complicated. So let's actually talk about then, what do we really mean when we're building a machine learning product, and what are the different steps that go into the process? So to simplify the world, right, you will be collecting data, and that data might represent whatever task it is you're doing. You'll then label that data. You'll then train a model, right? So you'll take all of this data that maybe says, these images are of dogs and these images are of cats. You'll label those images. You'll train a model to predict whether or not an image is of a dog or a cat. Then, you'll do something with that data. You'll maybe filter it or the model outcome. You'll filter it, you'll rank it, you'll aggregate it. And then the users will see whatever product you create. They'll see some effect. And your users will then behave in a way that influences the data that you collect the next time, right? This is kind of a standard AI machine learning pipeline. So then when you ask this question of, okay, how do you build an inclusive or equitable machine learning product? I think the first question people ask is like, okay, where is the bias coming from? Like, right, where are we building for exclusion rather than inclusion? And the reality of the situation is that we see human bias at every single stage of this process, right? So let's start at the beginning. Where are you collecting your data from? Then who is labeling that data? And who wrote the guidelines on how you should label that data, right? For example, let's say we're collecting data about whether or not something is appropriate for kids. Well, who gets to decide what is appropriate for kids. People who are parents versus people who are not may have very, very different opinions of what that is, right? And the same thing might be true for people in different communities, people who represent different cultures, people who have different ideological beliefs. Then when you're actually choosing to train your model, you set a particular objective and you set some metrics that you're optimizing for. Who picked those metrics and objectives and what goals were they meeting? What did you actually do with that model? And what kinds of human biases were in the design choices that you made? We also know that our users have biases. We all have conscious and unconscious biases that affect the way that we interact with the world. And then, of course, the users act in that way, which then funnels back into the loop. And so because human bias intervenes at every single stage of this process, to actually build an inclusive product means questioning ourselves at every single one of these stages. At every single one of these stages, it means asking, for whom? I'm collecting data to represent whose needs, who is being included in this and who is potentially being left out. And that doesn't mean to say that every single one of these stages needs to be fully comprehensive the first time you tackle a product, but I think it does mean we need to be intentional about it. And we need to be intentional about asking, what am I leaving out? Who am I leaving out? And if I am, what does that mean for my product? What does that mean for how it will work for those users? Where am I launching that product? And what should I be doing to mitigate that concern? So what I want to talk about today is 5 different things that I think are important when you're building inclusive AI. And of course, these aren't comprehensive, these aren't the full set, but hopefully they will provide some interesting fodder for thought as you go out and build products of your own. The first one that I'll touch on is being thoughtful about your goals and objectives. As we talked about in this full cycle of work, there's a big step there in terms of actually setting the goal of using a model. And I think the question I would ask in the first place is, do you even need a machine learning model? So let's look actually at an example. And I'm not as familiar with the UK education system. Some of you in this call will be much more familiar with it than I am. But a couple years ago, when COVID first hit all of us, and when exams weren't possible in person, the government of the United Kingdom thought, well, okay, how do we ensure that we can still give users and students scores that can allow them entrance into university? And so they said, okay, how can we actually provide proxies for your A-level grades? And instead of offering it as actually an exam that students take, they replaced that with an algorithm. And what they saw, perhaps not surprisingly, is that the increase in A-level grades was much higher for independent schools, for private education, than it was for the public education. In other words, the algorithms were optimizing for higher scores from certain schools, seeing on average lower scores for schools that honestly were in maybe lower economic statuses. And of course, this was extremely infuriating to users and students who maybe had studied extremely hard, but who were in a particular school or in a particular environment where they were actually getting a lower score. It was also infuriating to students who were in private schools and were aiming to apply to university who were getting scores that they didn't expect, right? For any student, getting a score that you didn't feel like represented your values, your studying, your work didn't feel like the right outcome. And I find these posters in particular really standing out because your algorithm doesn't know me. Your algorithm doesn't know what I'm capable of and what I would have pulled off had I taken this exam. And so as I read these articles and I read about this product, I thought, wait a second, why were we solving this problem with an algorithm in the first place, right? And I think that this is the question that we often don't ask. When we use algorithms, we seek to make things easier. We seek to make things scalable. And the question really here is, how do we actually define our goals? In this case, the goal of the product and the goal of the use case here was to help students still be calibrated for university applications. The solution was to proxy the grade of an exam for those students, when there could have been many other ways, possibly still using algorithms, to solve that problem. And the questions I think we have to ask is, okay, well, what was the end goal? Are we actually solving that end goal? Who is it serving effectively when we do so? Potentially students from higher income neighborhoods, higher privilege, ability to attend certain types of education. And who is it leaving behind? And so whenever you build a product, I think that's the first question to answer. And once you do, I think it's going to open up all of these different questions for you about how you actually build that product. That leads to the next goal. How do you go beyond the average? And this actually, I think, is really meaningful because it changes the way we often think about the way we build products. So typically, one of the first things you learn probably in middle school math is the importance of mean, median, mode, the importance of having an average. When you build products, you set metrics around precision, around recall, around accuracy. And all of those things tell you the average, right? On average, how well is your product performing? It won't work well for some users, it'll work better for others, but we try to simplify the world to be able to rationalize how a product works through a single number. The problem, of course, is that an average is exactly that. It is an average. It works for a majority of the population, but not for every single user, not for every single need. And so the challenge is, how do you both maintain the average while also recognizing that there is more to consider in the product that you're building for? So I like this example from Gone with the Wind as a great example because we love Rotten Tomatoes, or at least I love Rotten Tomatoes, right? I often make it a habit to go check to see, on average, how good is a movie? Should I watch it? And here you see a movie that has a 91% score and 8.1 on IMDb. But what you don't get from these numbers is how many users were concerned about the portrayal of slavery. Are there users or groups of users who didn't appreciate the movie and who didn't actually think the movie was telling a story in the right way or with the right perspectives? And so the question then to ask is, well, how do we balance those two things? I'm not trying to argue that we should get rid of averages. It is still very helpful to see these types of numbers. But I think as product developers, as designers, as engineers, it's also our job to make sure we slice these metrics by the different communities, by different user needs, by different intents, so that we can actually understand the inherent variance that would exist when you have a diversity of users with a diversity of needs. To actually do that, there's a few different things you can just practice in your day-to-day work. One is develop metrics that test for different user groups and communities. The simplest way of doing that is just to slice, right? Start by saying, okay, instead of asking about the accuracy overall, what does the accuracy look like for this community of users versus this community of users versus this community of users? What does it look like if I were to slice precision versus recall? Am I seeing different types of errors for different types of communities? Another key part of that is actually doing that extra user research, right? Trying to actually understand what are the different user experiences that make up your data, and also understanding the harms and the societal context that exists for different users. We have a history of systemic discrimination in the United States, and that affects the way that different users might engage with or use our different products. So in terms of developing metrics that test for different communities, here's an example that we find from our own products at Google. Here you see an example from the Google Toxicity API, built by a team called Jigsaw within our organization. We released this tool for the first time in 2017. And the goal of the tool was to help online conversations, like online, comments or chat forums, better moderate by providing scores for toxicity. And so the idea was you would give a sentence a score from 0 to 1, where 1 is extremely toxic, right? So if I said, I hate every dog on the planet, that would be an extremely toxic sentence. If I gave it a score of 0 because I said, I love dogs, they're so cute, that would be a score of 0, very not toxic. And immediately when we released this tool for users to test out and experiment with, a user found this example. The comment, I am straight, got a score of 0.04, while the comment, I am gay, got a score of 0.86, extremely toxic. And of course, that is not the way that we would ever want a product of ours to work. that is not an inclusive product, and it could perpetuate actually inequity across other products that were to use this tool. So the question is, how did we actually get there? Of course, we had tested the model for accuracy and for performance and for error rates before we had released it. We didn't want to be seeing scores that were so off in terms of predicting toxicity. But we had never actually sliced our product to see how these numbers differed across communities. And when we actually sliced by sentences that contained different identity terms referencing different groups, we saw that certain groups were seeing significantly high error rates as compared to others. So in this particular graph, the darker the purple, the less accurate. And what being able to slice these metrics actually enabled us to do was get to a point where we could improve and improve and improve and improve the model until by the time we got to the version 6 of the model, you can see that things evened out significantly and we had significantly more accuracy, significantly higher performance across these identity terms. It's also worth noting that the way that we measured this matters. In this particular example, we took a bunch of synthetic examples, if you will, right? I took the sentence, I am straight, replaced it with I am gay, replaced it with I am Indian, I'm a woman. And we actually saw how well we performed across these sentences that we created. But in the real world, people use these terms differently and often in ways that are harmful and hateful, especially when you're talking about online discourse, which can have a diversity of people with a diversity of opinions and perspectives. And so we found that even while we were doing better on our data, that didn't actually mean we were doing well across the data that we actually saw in the real world. And we actually had to modify our metrics to get better at this. And so one other point I want to really emphasize here is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all or a one-size metric to inclusion, and especially when you want to build for equitable products. Often we talk about the difference between equality and equity. Equality means, yes, given the same tools and resources, given the exact same sentences, we're performing equally for two groups. But as we want to push to bigger, better standards of actually building for equity, it means recognizing where there are differences in the experiences of groups. For example, maybe certain communities do experience more hate and toxicity online. And therefore, building a better product for those communities actually means potentially collecting more data, defining different metrics, thinking about the ways that this product could be different in different hands and how we actually build and design differently. And so when we actually looked at real data, right, when we actually looked at the different experiences for users, the story changed. Instead of us performing extremely well across communities, we still saw differences in error rates and potentially problematic error rates for certain communities, and found ourselves going back to the drawing board to figure out what we could do differently. And that's really critical, right? Because when you're actually building a product, we often want to have one metric or two metrics that we really, really optimize for. And what we found here is that different metrics needed to be thought about so that we could actually account for the more holistic set of goals and perspectives. And that leads me to the next point that I made earlier, which is that we really do need to understand the different users who underlie our data. I think it's appealing often to look at data as billions of points that all come together to make a story. But the reality is, behind each one of these gray boxes is a person who has a different life history, a different story, a different set of experiences. And the makeup of these people and communities is also going to differ. And so actually going through that step of saying, hey, how can this experience be different for different users is actually a part of the product design process, right? We always talk about user research when we build products. We talk about the ways that we design and build these stories. And so I think it's really important to think about, how do these individual users come to play? This goes back to the original examples of our Barbie dolls. Who are the different users who might be purchasing this doll? And what are they looking for in that doll? And how can we build one that really works for them? How, in online conversations, can we account for different community needs, both in supporting freedom of speech and open dialogue and conversation, but in also preventing toxic harm and hate? The interesting thing is, your model really will only be as inclusive as your data. Now, I want to caveat that, right? It is not the case that just because you have inclusive or representative data of a particular population that you will have an inclusive experience. But if you don't have inclusive and representative data, you will not have an inclusive experience. And this to me is another great example. Here you see 4 different examples of weddings. The first 3 represent mostly traditional Western weddings. They represent different types of weddings in different types of settings, but Western weddings with a bride in a white dress. On the right, you see a wedding from East Africa with a different set of outfits and a different placing. We looked at a data set called the Open Images data set, and we trained a model on that data set to be able to predict whether or not an image was of a wedding, and many other different labels. And what you see when the model was trained on that data set was for the first 3 images, it recognizes them as ceremony, wedding, bride, man, groom, dress. For the last image, it recognizes it as person or people. And when we went back to actually look at the Open Images data set, we found that it significantly represented a Western population. And so, of course, when the model was trained on it, it had never learned to recognize that what the man and woman are wearing in the last image were a wedding outfit. The importance of every step of the process becomes, I think, even clearer here. Even though we sliced the model to see how it performed across these different communities, because the data itself that we had trained the model on was not representative of different communities in different regions, our evaluations found gaps. And those are gaps that would only be filled if we actually took a step back to see what we could do to collect a wider sample. I think it's also important to note that you can't always solve for every problem with data, and that different needs also need to be thought about throughout the product design process. So for example, while with this particular model, we thought about it and actually introduced new data into the situation. In this particular cases, we actually found that it wasn't just about improving our model. It was actually about making fundamental changes to our policy and product design. On the left, you see an example from Google's Gmail Smart Reply. So if you use Gmail, which hopefully many of you do, you'll note that we have the chips at the bottom that allow you to automatically click something to reply, right? So when someone sends you an email, there'll be like 3 suggestions of little short sentences that you can use to respond to the email. And the goal there is, how do we actually, help users get to more efficiency, finish their sentences faster? But take an example where I sent you an email that said, hey, did the engineer, come into work today? And if you said, yes, he did. And let's say that's what was suggested to you in the chip. And that, in many ways, represents histories of systemic bias and societal context, right? Histories of users who are data points who have represented different experiences. Histories of not slicing our data and not recognizing the biases that we're building in. But we realized that even if we made our model better, even if we collected more data, we still wouldn't know whether the engineer was male, female, or non-gender binary, whether that individual wanted to go by a particular pronoun or not. And so instead of actually trying to just make our model better, we actually said, you know what? We actually don't want to suggest gendered pronouns. We don't think that's our place. We don't think it's appropriate. And we think the user should actually have the choice to input the pronoun that they think makes the most sense. We also see a similar example when you think about suggestions when you type something into search. When you want to go search something, we try to help you along. We try to help you to complete with common queries or suggestions. But is there a good suggestion to complete Indian people are? Most answers that would follow that would be considered a stereotype, whether it be positive or negative. And we realized very quickly that maybe those are some suggestions we don't actually want to provide. That again, we want to allow users to go on the journey that makes most sense for them without introducing more stereotypes into that situation. And so the big theme with all of these examples I gave is that fairness and inclusion and equity concerns are not one size fits all. Different concerns may require different metrics, and different concerns may require different approaches. They may require you to measure your problem differently. So for example, here I have 2 different things of disproportionate performance, which is what you saw when we first measured the Jigsaw toxicity API and compared it between one community and the other. You might also want to be able to measure representational harm, which is how often am I introducing a stereotype into my product, like the examples that I just gave. These are both important problems. These are both risks of harm to our end user, but need to be measured and likely mitigated extremely differently. So with that, I want to quickly run through some of these last three so that we do also get time for questions. But I also want to be very conscious of the fact that while the first two really talked about what you as an individual or as a product owner can do, it's also really, really important to recognize that we don't actually have all the answers as product owners or product designers or engineers or builders. And that there are many, many individuals who have more context to provide the situation to help you understand the system in which you're building. An example that really strikes me, if any of you have seen Coded Bias, which is a documentary film on Netflix, you'll have seen the significant impacts that face recognition technology has had across communities, in potential, especially because of many, many technologies that have biases across skin tones, and especially for communities of color. And so when you take that context, you ask yourself, well, okay, how should we leverage that understanding and that series of history and research that people have done into the history of face recognition and the impact of face recognition to be able to impact our products? And should Google actually have a stance on face recognition, for example? And here you kind of see a timeline of how we've thought about face recognition as we've also built more and more context, thanks to people like Timnit Gebru and Joy Buolamwini and the building of gender shades research and other research efforts turning into the documentary Coded Bias, that really have brought seminal work around face recognition and its harms to the forefront. And so what we did is we said, okay, how do we put our principles, and I'll talk through our AIR principles in a bit, how do we put through our Google principles into practice? And one key thing I really wanted to highlight here is what I have listed in numbers 3 and 4. How do we really seek input from experts who understand some of these concerns in practice, who understand and civil and human rights, who are able to bring those challenges to the table and to help us understand whether actually using face recognition in a product would increase harm for users, and what are the ways that we could mitigate that? And so what we actually did was run a human rights impact assessment. And we brought in expertise in the human rights and civil rights space to actually understand what is the impact on different individuals and users, and how could we actually determine recommendations to make our product better. And the reason why I want to highlight this is because I think it's incredibly important as builders for us to recognize that we don't have all the answers, especially when we're trying to understand a very complicated system that has existed for generations. And when we were actually able to use this, it significantly changed the way that we built and designed our product. For example, we built a celebrity recognition product that allowed you to, if you are watching a movie, it could tell you what celebrity is in the film. But we took active steps back to really constrain the product to a single set of examples or celebrities, to a single use case, celebrity recognition, in terms of instead of offering a facial recognition solution broadly, and to be able to bring in insights around transparency, accountability, the metrics that we should be evaluating for every step of the way. So in addition to evaluating and setting metrics for yourself, in addition to evaluating whether or not you have a strong goal and objective for your product, also take a step back and say, okay, what is the broader history I may need to be aware of when I'm building this product? And who else might have that expertise who can bring to the table? It's also important to recognize that users are critical here as well. And being thoughtful about the transparency of your product and your accountability to end users or others who may have thoughts to share is also really critical. Because the reality is, with all of our best intentions, we all have our own biases, conscious and unconscious, that feed into the way that we design and build technology. And so the technology that we build is a representation of all that we are, right? And that goes back to that initial car example that I shared at the beginning. All of these human biases lead to some sort of downstream effect. And so that means that when we build into products, it is contextual. The decision makers that we have, the users that we're building for, the data sets that we collected, the metrics, whether or not humans were involved, all of things we just talked through for the last, 30 minutes or so. And so it's really, really important to be intentional and transparent about our choices. There is going to be no such thing as a fully inclusive product that is inclusive for every single individual, because the reality is our world is so diverse and represents so many different individuals that when you collect a data set, there's going to be somebody in someone's unique circumstances that are left out. And the question really is, what are we deciding when we're making those products, and who are those decisions working for and not working for? And so being extremely intentional every step of the way can make a huge difference. So one thing I'll also say it as a call to action, and you can always use this QR code in the top right to see our examples, is to document every choice you make. So here you see an example of a model card for our face detection API. So this API, takes a picture of an image of a set of individuals and puts a bounding box around their face. So it helps you detect whether or not there's faces of humans in the image. And while this use case may seem, relatively standard, there's a number of design decisions that went in, right? What data we chose to collect, how the model was trained, what limitations or trade-offs were made in that process. And so documenting those choices and actually putting them out there not only allowed developers who were picking up this model to actually be intentional about what they were doing with it, but also allowed us to understand our own choices and to be sure that we were doing so in a way that felt reasonable, comfortable, and equitable. We were able, for example, to actually articulate how the performance worked, going back to our notion about metrics, to make sure here in this example that the model worked well across different perceived age ranges. And while the metrics and the conversations and the decisions you make might be different for different users or different models, the choice to actually document those choices is already a first step to building better, more thoughtful products. You can also do this for your data, right? Here's an example of a data card for a data set we built to extend open images, the data set I mentioned earlier, to represent a more diverse set of communities. And on one hand, when we first were building the data set, the intention was to capture a more global representation, capture weddings from across the world. But interestingly enough, if you actually look at the geographic distribution of the open images data set, it turned out that the way we collected it led the data set to have 83% of its images from India. And so while we were succeeding in part of our goal to capture a less Western representation of images, we weren't actually succeeding in capturing a truly global range, right? And the actual act of documenting this forced us to confront that, and to confront that while this data set did have significant value, its values might be different than what our initial intentions were. And that you actually need to question, okay, what does this data set do then? And for someone who is going to pick up this data set, let's say I were going to use an image data set and I wanted to represent Central and South America, this data set probably would not be one that was good for that use case. And only through the act of documenting were we able to really make that explicit and actually go back and think through how we continue to make this better and a more global representation. If you're interested in learning more about model or data cards or how to bring transparency into your product development process, I recommend checking out Partnership on AI's About ML effort, which is working on thinking about how can we bring more standardization and more transparency to the work that we do. And now, finally, to our last point. Give users a voice in your product. We talked about goals. We talked about building for a diversity of users and thinking about a diversity of metrics. We talked about bringing in expertise and understanding the broader human rights, civil rights, societal context behind your product. We talked about transparency and being really clear about what you're building and what you're choosing. But at the end of the day, our products are affecting a set of users, affecting a set of people. And in fact, sometimes when we use the word users, it feels like we're talking about, a data point, someone who is consuming the product that we're providing. But at the end of the day, these are humans who are people who have rich lives and opinions and thoughts about how they want to consume the product. So here's an example from Google Translate that I think really highlights why giving users a choice and a voice in the product can be so important. For those of you who are multilingual, you'll know that often translating between English and another language, other languages often have much more gender embedded into the terms that you use, right? So for example, in English, while you use the word friend for all genders, When you translate to Spanish, you have amigo, the masculine form of the term, and amiga, the feminine form of the term. And friend can mean either one of those things. And so when you're translating, the question becomes, well, how do we do that? And in fact, we've seen concerns with Google Translate, where translating from a gendered language to a non-gendered language, a non-gendered language to a gendered language, can translate stereotypes. For example, translating doctor to the masculine form of the word and nurse to the feminine form of the word. And so we thought, okay, should we make the model better? How can we improve the quality? And yes, we want to do all of those things. But we actually realized at the end of the day, it's the user who needs to provide the context on whether they're speaking about the masculine form or the feminine form. And that rather than simply trying to make the model better, we could actually give users more ability to weigh into the product themselves, to allow them to provide their own context, to serve their need from the experience. And we also want to make sure that users can tell us when the experience doesn't work for them. Here, for example, you see the ability for a user to hide a story, to say they're not interested in a topic, to say they're not interested in a particular set of stories. Their ability to provide that context can influence our experience, can make that experience better or stronger. And the thing is we make dozens of small decisions every day that affect the way that our users can provide feedback to us, that can affect the way we design and build the product. And each of these decisions, while on their own seem really small, they add up to have very strong impacts on the experience for different users. Here, for example, you see an onboarding flow. Many of you have used these in products ranging from finding movies that you like to finding songs or artists that you think are really awesome. And the question is, how do you pick these, right? Usually you'll scroll down, pick some that you like. Imagine that if I just made the choice to say, okay, you know what? I'm going to pick the topics that are most popular across all of my users. That might represent a very specific demographic who represents the majority of your product. So in the case of example, building an onboarding flow for YouTube, we actually asked ourselves, how do we pick the most popular topics from different regions, from different user communities that represent different types of intents and needs across music, across entertainment, across fashion, across sports, and actually bring those together to build an onboarding flow that is more likely to help users find their niche interests. And so just the small design decision to say, we're not actually just going to select the top most popular topics across the product, but we're actually going to select from different communities and user groups, allowed users to provide their voice in a way that worked for a larger set of users. And so every time you make a decision for your product, even if it's one that seems small and obvious, take a step back to say, wait a second, who is this solution obvious for? Who will this work for and who won't it? And you don't have to do this alone. Between UX design, engineering, public policy, and social science, you can actually bring together a diversity of disciplines that can bring together those experiences, similar to what we found with face recognition or what we talked about when we were initially talking about designing technical or non-technical products. So with that, I'm reaching the conclusion of my talk for today, and I'm hoping there's a number of questions and interesting discussion. And please do reach out if you have more thoughts on how do we really actually motivate building inclusive products in the product design process? How do we make this work for users who represent a diversity of needs, intents, backgrounds, communities? And how do we make sure that at the end of the day, we give every user a voice? Because representation matters in the way that we design our products, in the way that we build our products, and in the way that we enable our users to use them. Couple great resources if you're interested in learning more. I will warn, both are Google resources, but I hope they're useful. The first is the People and AI Guidebook. You can find it at pair.withgoogle.com/guidebook. And for anyone who's building a product for the first time or the second time or the nth time, hopefully this will give you a good set of tips to think about as you're building for responsibility. If you are building a machine learning product, you can go to tensorflow.org/resources/responsible AI. And there's a number of open source tools that will help you slice your metrics, help you drive some of the improvements that I shared earlier, help you look at your data sets and see whether or not they're representative. So I definitely check out both of these resources. And And I'll end with just a quick flag of Google's AI principles. These are 7 principles that we created in 2018 to help us guide the way that we build and design products. And the one that I really focused on today was the second one: avoid creating or reinforcing unfair bias. But whether it be about social benefit, building and testing for safety, being accountable, incorporating privacy design, these are all key concepts to making equitable products. And I think one thing I would challenge for all of you is start by building out that set of principles. What values do you want to build into your product? What matters to you when users use your product? And as you build these out, you'll find that they then lead to, intentionality and all of these other things we talked about today. So with that, I'll stop there and open up for questions. Thank you so much for having me. I hope this talk was helpful in finding at least a few interesting ways to think about being inclusive in your products. And I would definitely say, just main message, ask yourself at every stage of that design process, who is this for? Who am I leaving out? How can I be including that in the way that I measure, in the way that I collect my data, in the way that I build and design my product? And how do I make sure there are voices both on the development side as well as on the user side at every step of the way? Thank you.
All righty. Thank you so much, Tulsee. That was amazing. I know I enjoyed almost every minute of that. And we're very excited for questions now. We do have a few from the chat. I think one, just to kind of start this off, would be when we're talking about, long-term equity and implementing bias-free algorithms, what do you estimate this time frame to be? Is there a number of years you could assign to that? Do you think it's an ongoing process? What is your take on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that when we talk about, equity long term, I think the reality is that this has to be ongoing. And I think that's for 2 reasons, right? One is the world around us is constantly shifting, right? And so things that were true maybe 5-10 years ago may not be true in the same ways now, right? Especially as technology is changing and like the world is changing around us. And so I feel like it's one of those things where when you're designing for equity, it has to be this continuous question of like, okay, what does the system that we're in right now look like, right? And how do we design in a way that provides everyone the tools and the resources they need to succeed in that system? But I do think, one thing I want to call out is that I feel like it doesn't have to be, I feel like sometimes when we talk about building for equity, and especially in the context of companies that have deadlines and goals that they need to meet, it feels like one of those things that like you'll do as the next steps. You'll build an MVP and then you'll build it to be more inclusive and more inclusive. And I think what I'm hoping came through a little bit in this talk is it doesn't have to be that way, right? It can be a part of the way you design the product. And I think there are short-term things you can do as well as the long-term things that get you there.
And that's awesome. And I think you touched a little bit on, the company's responsibility and the fact that they have deliverables or deadlines to meet. So I think a follow-up question to that might then just be, how much of this do you think big tech companies should be held accountable for? And what kind of degree of responsibility do they have in ensuring fairness in their products and accessibility?
Yeah, I mean, a ton of responsibility. I think that, so I want to call it that, like, I do think regulation is actually really important here, right? Because I do think that if you just put these things in the hands of individual companies, different companies have different set of resources. They may interpret things in different ways. They may think about inclusion in different ways. And so I do think you need to get to a point where you do have basic standards that create consistency across the environment, right? Especially for things like face recognition. I think that having regulation for these types of like high risk technologies actually ensures that there is a consistent baseline across the community. But I do think if you're building a product, whether you're a big company, a medium-sized company, or a small company, you are accountable for making sure that that product works for a wide range of users who have a wide range of needs, especially if that's who you expect to use your product, right? And so I don't think that we should take that responsibility away, but instead ensure that we're building the right tools and resources to help people do that.
Yeah. And could you touch a little bit on the interplay between policy and, tech development? And if that's something that's manifested itself, in your career, and you've talked about this a little, but any examples that you could share about when that's been particularly important?
Yeah. And actually, I'll give an example that's not as related to Google, but I think is related to this advisory work that I'm doing right now with an insurance company. So insurance is actually like a very, very highly regulated field, right? And it's one where there are actually regulators per state. So every state regulates insurance differently and sets up policies accordingly. And so you actually, when you're building, especially if you're using AI or things like that in your insurance process, you actually have to align with those regulators and those policy requirements. And we're seeing policy changes come down from Europe. We're seeing them come down. Actually, Colorado has just built out algorithmic accountability policy for insurers and for high-risk technologies. And so as we're seeing these things come through, I think that's very directly affecting the way that we design our products. And in some ways, that's amazing because it's actually providing standards. But in other ways, I'm finding that we're actually having to work a lot to figure out how we interpret those standards, right? So if we say, for example, evaluate your product for fairness, well, what does that mean? I might evaluate it very differently than how somebody else evaluates a product for fairness. And so I think there's still a lot of work to do. And I think this is work that tech companies, technologists, policymakers actually have to do together to figure out how we actually define these metrics. Because, for example, how I'm working with Lemonade to define those metrics may not be the same as how another insurance company is interpreting that. And I think we need to start getting to a point where there's another layer of definition down from where we are now.
And do you have any thoughts on how we can, go about fostering that collaboration? Does it look like involving more, policy individuals in tech companies and kind of having those conversations? Is it something else? Do you have any ideas or thoughts on how we foster that?
I do think it's a two-way street thing where, like, I do think we need more policy. We need more policymakers and individuals who are in positions where they're writing this legislation to be more involved in understanding how tech companies operate, what are some of the decisions, how does the technology actually work. I think it would also help to have more technologists on the other side as well, involved in actually shaping and writing the language that actually comes out in policy, because I think there's a gap in understanding on both sides. And I think we often see that gap on a day-to-day basis where I may not actually understand what goes into defining policy and what are some of the trade-offs that went into actually defining the language. And then we see the same thing vice versa. And so I do think like having more just facilitating of that conversation is incredibly important. I do also think that it's really important for us to talk in more specifics. I think a lot of times, even when information is shared between policymakers and tech companies, it's shared in the abstract of like, oh, we should have more transparency. But actually providing more case studies of like, oh, here's actually a product example. Here's what transparency looked like for that example, right? And I think one of the things that I'm trying to do in my role is see how we can create more of those case studies with our products, right? Similar to some of the case studies I presented today, because I think a lot of this just becomes a lot easier to talk about when it's grounded in reality. Like, not that our conversations are not grounded in reality, but grounded in like very concrete notions.
And I think thinking about that a little bit more too, if we have involvement from both parties, right, they're coming together to the middle. Do you think in some ways would you be worried that might deter innovation if it's coming at the expense of increased regulation? Or is that something that,
That's a good question. I mean, there's often this like, I feel like false dichotomy between innovation and regulation, or like innovation and policy. Like, I think there's this fear that when regulation comes in, it'll slow things down because you won't be able to do things the way that you want to. But I actually think that's maybe even more so why we need this middle ground for that communication, because I actually don't think these things are at odds with each other, right? Like, I don't think it's the fact that you can't innovate if you also are trying to build a product that is inclusive for more users. I think it's about making sure that you have the right steps in the process while you innovate, right? So that instead of just doing user research and saying, I'll do user research in Silicon Valley with my users who are in Silicon Valley, right? How do I actually do user research that is more global, that reaches a broader range of users? I think those are things you can actually build into your design process. I think those are things you can build into the innovation that you're doing. And I think right now, the reason it feels like regulation and innovation are somehow at odds with each other is because the conversations aren't happening in the middle. And so then what ends up happening is you have regulation that maybe is either too broad or too specific. And so it actually feels harder to navigate rather than a conversation that actually works within the process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that is very interesting. And I think another question then would be, right, if we're holding these measures of accountability for the developers, how much of the
I think, accountability gap from things or cases that we can't account for with testing data or training data. Do we attribute to the machine itself or the technology itself and its lack of, complete human-like intelligence versus to the developers that were the ones making it, even despite best efforts, right, to ensure unbiased algorithms?
I think, part of the problem is, I think part of the problem is that we do have this issue where we assume that machines have more intelligence than they do, right? And so I think it comes down to like kind of what I was talking about in the beginning of the talk, which is like, is machine learning the right solution for this problem, right? And I think we should be using machine learning to solve problems that machine learning is good for, which is taking patterns and extrapolating them into insights and more efficient, larger scale applications. And what I mean by that is like a machine is a very good way, for example, of scaling out whether you're telling whether an image is a dog or a cat. Like that's a very good problem for a machine learning algorithm. Determining whether someone is a good fit for hiring at a company has tons of subjective characteristics to it, right? Whether someone is a good fit for your company has a lot to do with the way that you interview them. There's a lot of different parts of that process. And so assuming that a model can actually do that a machine can do that, assumes that a machine has way more intelligence than it actually does, right? And you can simplify that by saying like, okay, there are certain tasks that a machine should do. There are certain tasks as a part of the hiring process, maybe that a model is good for. And so bringing that back kind of to your question of like, is the fault on the developer or on the model? I think usually if the model has done something in a way that we're like, oh man, that was terrible and horrible, I would still put the fault on the way that we designed and developed the model. Because if we didn't put the right guardrails in place, if we didn't think about whether the use case was good to have a model in the first place, I think then that already is a problem in and of itself. Models will fail. There is no such thing as a foolproof model. And so I think it's our responsibility to make sure that there are guardrails in place for when that failure happens. And then of course, like we have to acknowledge that failure will happen and that it's not perfect. But I think that is a part of the way that we design and build the product.
And that's awesome. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think something important to end on perhaps might just be, these things that we've been talking about, working with ethics and responsibility in big tech. How can someone, an undergrad of our age, go from where they are now or where we are now and make career decisions that would end them up in a role where they can explore tech and these big questions that we've kind of touched on just briefly right today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll start by saying like, I didn't know that I would end up here or know that I would end up in a role like mine. And so I don't think there is a single path to get here. And in fact, actually, the individuals that I work with today in responsible AI come from a wide variety of backgrounds. There are people coming from social impact backgrounds, people like myself coming from computer science backgrounds, people coming from, PhDs where they've studied recommender systems in great detail. And I think the critical part, if you want to find yourself in a role like this, is to just make sure that you're bringing in these principles and best practices into the work that you're doing every day, right? No matter what role it is that you take or what product it is that you design and build, try to bring these best practices in, try to build these principles in, try to lead by example, right? And I think products that lead by example inherently set the stage for the future of the way that we work in this space, right? And you can think about that in a lot of ways, actually, right? Like Apple has set itself apart in terms of its work in privacy and set standards that the rest of the industry is trying to follow or build on top of. There's others who have done that in different ways with design, with responsibility, with thinking about inclusion. And so I think for all of you who are in undergrad who are thinking about this, I would say bring that into best practice. Make sure that you're taking social science classes in addition to computer science classes, because I think having that perspective of psychology, philosophy, social science, civil rights, human rights is critical to bring into your product work, right? And then use that when you start designing and building products. And then, of course, if you are interested specifically in working in the space of responsible AI, this space is continuing to grow. There's going to be more and more opportunities to kind of be fully invested in this space. And there are many different organizations you can look up to and be a part of. I mentioned Partnership on AI earlier. So there's just many different opportunities to get involved if you specifically want to be involved in this space too.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time. I learned so much. I'm sure the attendees did too. Is there any way, or I think we actually touched on this already, but there's tons of resources for everyone to look out for